To welcome our moderator for today, Richard Krause, and the director and members of the cast for Black Mass.
Welcome, everyone. Because we have just a short while with everyone, I'm going to dispense with my long-winded introductions and ask the assembled press to keep the questions to singular questions, not sort of the famous compound questions that people try and sneak past us, and to keep the questions to the subject matter of the film, please. Bruce Kirkland, I will start with you.
Good afternoon, Bruce Kirkland, Toronto Sun. Quick question for Johnny Depp. At the end of our session yesterday, you said, "Thank you to Scott for reviving my career." And I don't know if that's in jest, because I've never had the impression that you're desperate for box office, but that you choose...
Gagging for it. It's been the thrust of my interests since day one when I was about 19. Yeah, that's all I care about. 20 years of failures will do that to you.
But on a different level, why do you say that, and how do you feel when you choose a role that ends up satisfying you, that this one clearly did?
Well, you know, for me, with every character that you play, you know, as long as you've reached that, you've arrived at that place where you believe is the right place to be for the character, and if you feel that you've done service to the director, to yourself, to the author, then to me that's a success. The box office is kind of, you know, that's something else. That's certainly none of my business. You know what I mean? Once I'm wrapped on a film, it's just say goodbye to the character and then move forward. But yeah, I was joking about Scott reviving my career, but he's revived my career. No, no, he's a magnificent filmmaker, and it's amazing to, you know, to step into the ring with someone like him, like Scott, because it's a whole new ball game. You know, he's coming in, you know, with, you know, a full clip and ready to go. You know, I mean, with very creative ideas, very brave ideas, and so it's nice to see that. You know, again. Thanks.
Go ahead.
Stephen from Belgium. Question from Mr. Depp. Can you tell us a little bit about your Lon Chaney-esque transformation, but this time it's a character from real life in comparison to the fictional characters you've done before?
You mean that the Mad Hatter never existed? Or Willy Wonka? Are you going to tell me there's no Santa Claus now? I mean, what about the Easter Bunny? Seriously. No, you know, when you're playing obviously a fictional character, there's room for, you know, you can sort of stretch it out into all kinds of strange places, which I've taken a lot of heat for. But when you're playing someone, you know, who either existed or exists, there's a tremendous kind of amount of responsibility, at least for me, you know, to no matter who they are, no matter whether they're deemed good or bad or whatever, you have a responsibility to that person because it's their life. You also have a responsibility to, you know, history and truth to some degree. So that was very important going in. And to be as accurate with regards to the look was extremely important to me. It's really everything in terms of finding Jimmy Bulger. So I have to say, you know, there's a makeup artist that I worked with for years, a guy named Joel Harlow, who's just brilliant. And he sculpted Bulger's face on top of a cast of mine. And we did about 5 or 6 tests until we you know, got to that place where it really felt like, you know, Jimmy Bolger. So it was much to the chagrin of probably the producers and money people, but it was a couple of hours in makeup, you know, every day.
If I could just add something to what Johnny just said. You know, Johnny physically transforms for all of his parts, and we knew that we would get this look right. But as a fan of Johnny Depp, as a fan of cinema, and then certainly as the director of the film, the big transformation for me was a man who is very soulful and kind and gentle and very thoughtful, and then to see him transform into, yes, you, and then to see him transform into a man who was cold and cunning and chilling at times, some say diabolical, of course tender, all of those sort of things, was mesmerizing to watch, not simply just as the director, but as a fan, because that man that you see on screen is not the man who's sitting to my right.
I'm going to expand that question, if I may, to the other members of the cast who are also playing real-life characters. I'd like to know what responsibility you felt to the characters that you were playing, to the real-life people you were playing, and what sort of research? Did you meet them? Did you meet family members? I know, Johnny, you met with Jay Kearney, who was Bolger's lawyer. I'm just wondering what sort of outreach some of the other members of the cast did as well. Joel, I could start with you if you're...
I was playing John Connolly, who is alive and with us, albeit in federal prison and a little hard to reach. And the question of whether or not, I guess there's one way to get in there. And then I would have had to kind of opt out of the movie, I guess. The question, however, of whether I should go to meet him was, you know, whether or not I could. I made a decision after I watched a bunch of court footage of him and daytime interviews that he did when the indictments were falling, that his defense of himself and his actions, as he says, sanctioned under the FBI's top echelon criminal informant program, that John would have a very different version of the events of this story because he feels like he was scapegoated. And so the idea of going to see him felt a little dishonest to me. You know, to go to prison and go, hey man, I just want to listen to you talk and watch you walk, and now I'm going to go over here and tell the world that you're a bad dude. It felt dishonest. So, I mean, there was enough for me to cobble from stories told, and a lot of old colleagues of John's, FBI colleagues, had told me certain things about him, and there were certain pearls of wisdom in that were enough. But, you know, at some point I have to say that this is, you know, we're telling a true story, but what is the truth? How much of the truth do we know? You know, at some point, you know, you got to plant your flag in the ground. So this is our version of the truth. This is Scott's vision, based on a wonderful book written by the journalist Dick and Gerald, who wrote Black Mass, and who really were brave and risked their skin at a time when these guys weren't in federal prison to expose the truth. So, you know, they gave us their truth. We then did our version of the truth, and this is my version of John Connolly, but I can never presume to know the man well enough.
Dakota, did you look into Lindsay's life?
I did. I did as much, you know, research was available to me. I didn't get to meet her beforehand, I mean, or yet. But the majority of the footage that I found on her was pretty recent, and it was sort of her looking back on her time with Jimmy Bolger. And I mean, obviously the time when you see them together is when she's quite young. So a lot of that came from working that out with Scott and Johnny.
I can go, Rory?
I played the character of Stephen the Rifleman Fleming, who actually didn't get that name, the Rifleman, from shooting a bunch of people, but actually from being in the war. But I felt a tremendous amount of responsibility to, you know, not only to try to tackle this Boston accent, which is incredibly, for me, hard to do, but also just being around the people in Boston, and this story is so precious to them. and it's almost like you know, a folk tale at this point. But it's theirs, and they believe it's theirs, and so you feel like this responsibility not only to play and get the essence of this character right, but the more you meet these lovely people of Boston, they have such beautiful hearts, that responsibility almost grows, because they're kind of like, you know, you guys better not fuck this up, you know, this is ours.
Jesse?
Yeah, I wasn't able to meet Kevin Weeks, but I did, you know, he wrote a book, and I just obsessed over that and tore that apart. And you know, luckily there were quite a few interviews, and yeah, I mean, I feel like the first month you're just obsessing over every detail and just trying to explore every possible lead. And then at a certain point, kind of like Joel said, you have to realize that it's the truth, especially in this particular story. It was very complicated, and there were many different versions of it. So at a certain point, you just kind of have to let it all go and hope you did enough, you know.
Would anyone else like to add? Let's move back to the press. Yep, go right ahead.
This question really is a segue from what you guys have just been discussing. And this is specifically for Scott Cooper. If you're making a biopic, writing it, directing it, what should be emphasized? Telling your subject story as truthfully and as objectively as you can? Or is it okay, you know, to alter it for the sake of narrative clarity or adding to the entertainment value?
Well, the truth is, as these men have alluded to, the truth was very elusive. Jimmy Bulger had one point of view. The FBI had another, of course. Fred Weishak, the prosecutor, had yet another. And then, of course, our esteemed reporters from which the book was derived, they also had yet another. So I had a difficult time in telling that. But what I realized in that process was that I'm not making a documentary. And I don't think audiences come to narrative features for the facts. I think they come for psychological truth. I think they come for deep emotion and humanity. And I never really set out to make a gangster picture or a crime genre, because I've said this before, I had great trepidation just making a crime or a gangster picture, because many of my favorite films and many of the best films ever made live in this genre. And that's a fool's errand to try in any way to achieve what Francis Coppola or Mr. Scorsese or Lou Matter, the rest of them have achieved. So what I said to myself, certainly, and to my cast, was that we're making a very humanistic drama. It's too easy to make James Whitey Bulger into a one-dimensional villain. I wanted to see a man who was cold and a man who was chilling at times, one who was very cunning, but one who also could be very tender with his dying son. He could be humorous with his mother, loving with his brother. That was what interested me most. And then, of course, you take all of the research that you have compiled to that point, and then you say, this is the story I'm telling, and hopefully it's as truthful as it can be. And then you have the people with whom you're doing research who tell you this is as truthful as they recalled it, as they were living it for 30 or 40 years. But it's really an emotional and psychological truth that I'm always searching for.
We have another question right here. Yep.
Mila Kanev, Mix TV. Question for Johnny Depp. I would like to know about your creative process. How do you prepare for that role? And because it's a violent role, but it's a different violent role, what you've done before.
I mean, initially, I was certainly familiar with the story of Jimmy Bulger, and which is fascinating in itself. And then you start reading the books, and there are various angles. You know, everybody, as Scott said, everybody's got their own take on what went down exactly. And it's, you know, it's still a little up in the air on a lot of it. First thing I did was I I contacted Bulger's lawyer, Jay Carney, to request, you know, I wanted the opportunity to meet Jimmy Bulger, to hear his take, certainly, you know, because when I played Donnie Brasco, I had the, you know, I was very fortunate to have spent a lot of time with Joe Pistone, and in that I was able to make a lot of changes in the screenplay that weren't remotely true. So we you know, I was able to get that stuff in. With Jimmy Bulger, I don't know what it might have been like, what I would have taken from that, other than being able to study him and sponge from him. But about a week after I made the request, I got a message from Mr. Carney that said, Jimmy respectfully declines, as he is not a great fan, as you can imagine, of the book, nor any of the books. So, you know, that was, from there on, you know, I basically just, I had Mr. Carney, who was right up front and saying, I'll tell you these bits, but I will not tell you that, you know, he would never, you know, sort of put his client into any sort of weird situation. But he was very helpful with regard to, I suppose, the heart of Bulger, and I hate to say it, the character, but the heart of the man. And then you just, you know, there's a little bit of surveillance footage. There's very little audio. But I got to tell you, like, you know, like Rory was saying, the people of South Boston were incredibly helpful with regard to that accent, because even South Boston is very different from, you know, other little slivers of Boston or Massachusetts. Southie's really got its own language almost. So in any case, I suppose after all of that, my intention was not to go out and create someone who's evil, because I don't think any of us, well, occasionally maybe, I don't think any of us wake up in the morning and shave or brush our teeth and go, I'm so evil, I'm so horrible. I approached James Bulger as a human being who, you know, was multifaceted and, you know, did have a side to him that was, you know, human, loving, and all that, you know. And then he had his business, and as we all know, there are certain businesses out there that the language of that work is violence, and so that's really the only way I could approach it. Thank you. Thanks.
Take another question right here, please.
Barbara Dudinska, Slovak News Agency. I have a question for Julianne. The scene where Johnny's character come to the bedroom is pretty chilling and intense. Like, you totally got me right there. So I really want to know what went in preparation, and even if Johnny can kind of like say something about it. Thank you very much to both of you.
Well, I knew from on the page that he would be there when I opened the door, and that he would be asking me these questions, and that he would touch my throat. But Scott does not like to rehearse at all, which I was happy about also. And so on the day we were in this great big dark sound stage, they had built up the room and the door, and so basically he just said action, and I opened the door. And there was Whitey Bulger. So before I even opened my mouth, there's some sort of menace and energy, and sort of something's already happening. So we did it not too many times. A couple times. I think you did one setup on my side and one on Johnny's, and we did it a couple times, and then Scott took me aside and we talked about it a little bit, what happened, and sort of also reminding me that my husband's downstairs letting this happen, and that sort of helped. But I've been a fan of Johnny since 21 Jump Street, so I've like studied his face for about 25 years, and when I opened the door...
You're too young for that.
I said, bless you, bless you. I opened the door and I didn't see any of him there. I mean, it's magic what he does, but as Scott said, the exterior, of course, but it's something that's coming from inside that was the most sort of affecting thing, and it was... I could have stayed there all day. I would have liked to have done it like 10 to 12 more times.
Me too. I will say there are scenes in the film that, you know, we're all around very calloused crew members who go from movie to movie to movie, grip or a gaffer, and then there were certain scenes in which you could see people watching the monitors and what these actors were doing. In this particular scene, in many scenes, it was taking their breath away. And as the film's director, it's that's a rare place to be in and a great privilege.
I'm going to direct a question, please, to Kevin and David. I spoke with Dick and Jerry, who wrote the book that the film, or two of the books that the film is based on. And I thought the obvious thing was that they would have been intimidated by Whitey Bulger, but he said no, or they both said no. It was more sort of heat from the FBI than there was from Bulger. In your research, did you speak with FBI agents? Did you speak with anyone that may have been involved in the case? And did you get a sense of any of that?
Okay. Oh, all right. No, I didn't speak with anybody. I guess in thinking about this role, I think you think about the essence of the character more than the actuality. And I think that there is a difference between, based on a true story is an interesting term, because reality is not always truth. So, like, John Morris didn't look anything like me. He's a tiny guy. He's like, I mean, in these pictures that I've seen, he's a tiny guy. But what I wanted to bring was, like, the essence of this man who breaks, And so that was really where I started from, just in very personal work in that direction. So it was less about those sort of details. The research that I did was on the Black Mass book itself, which has tons of details in it, like how he started to go down these roads, like these Lucchese boots. I think it's Lucchese. Is that how it's pronounced, Joel? Lucchese boots that Joel's character receives, and my character also got a plane ticket for a mistress of his under a case of wine. And that was sort of how he started to get involved. And it's just very interesting to think about how easy it was. And I mean, that scene at the dinner table that I have with Johnny is sort of like, these guys really wanted to befriend him. They wanted to be liked by him. And that was just a very interesting dynamic that I wanted to explore. And that was really sort of the foundation of where I began. It was less about the FBI angle, more about the relationships.
And Kevin, for you?
I never get to play real people. My character is a combination of a few people. I just never get that gig. I want to do that someday. But so for me, it was really about whatever kind of stuff I would do with anybody. Where is he from? Scott had some ideas about that. Why has he chosen law enforcement as a career? What's his home life like? All these kinds of things that you never see in the thing, but just becomes sort of like the foundation of playing any character.
Carrie, we'll go to you, please.
The next take on Super Channel. My question's for Johnny, and if Scott wants to chime in, that'd be great too. Just want to ask about the mannerisms that we see Whitey have in the film. There seems to be a cleanliness almost to the way he acts. He doesn't like the guy fingering the peanut bowl. He picks up his kid's bike. I want to ask you about some of the things you wanted to hone in on. Things like, I noticed that the character doesn't blink a lot either.
Yeah, there was the idea of minimal blinking, I suppose, is like a predatory, and focus, and trying, attempting to go, to sear his way through that person with his eyes, to get inside their brain, to control them in a way. As far as the sort of obsessive cleanliness, that kind of thing, he's a, as far as everything I've been able to understand is that, yeah, he was very much like that. So Scott and I, talked about, it's such a nice detail, especially for a guy who, basically, is in the world of extreme, violence and sometimes quite, graphic violence. So yeah, I really loved the sort of dichotomy of that obsessive compulsive, clean the hands, the guy with the peanuts would, he had the guy continued, he'd have probably blown his brains out right there, Well, so would I. Never eat peanuts at a bar, just telling you. There have been studies. But yeah, no, it's definitely a major peeve, and we thought it was a great detail to.
Yeah, I'm always very interested in very specific behavior, whether it's the obsessive-compulsive disorder that Jimmy Bolger might have had, or the character that Peter Sarsgaard plays, this kind of frantic anxiety. But as it relates to Jimmy Bolger, in the surveillance footage that I studied and that Johnny looked at, and from all the people that I spoke to who were around him, there was a guy who was very, very comfortable, very confident, very secure in his physicality, and was someone who wasn't afraid to use that to intimidate. If you and I are having a conversation and we might stand 18 inches apart, Jimmy Bolger might enclose that to about 12 inches, and that's an intimidation factor. This is a guy who's very economical in his movements, a guy who, from what I saw, didn't blink a lot, because blinking oftentimes will signify indecision or weakness. And as you notice, Johnny, when he's in a lot of these very tight shots in these scenes, he made that decision not to. And I'll never forget that Al Pacino once told me that when he was playing Michael Corleone and he was ascending to become the Godfather, that he would wear 20-pound weights on either ankle to give him that gravitas, so he would move with weight and a surety. And Johnny and I spoke about that type of physicality. And I will say that Jay Carney, Jimmy Bolger's attorney, came by the set and was watching this film for a couple of hours, which is unnerving in itself. And it had to be, certainly was for me, and had to be for Johnny. And I called cut. We were about to go on to another scene, and I could just see him sitting there staring at the monitor, shaking his head. And I introduced myself, walked over, and I said, were we just not getting it right? He said, no. He said, Scott, that man, it's as though a specter has returned, a ghost. He said, because the way he moves, the way he talks, his accent, the way he holds himself, the way he does sort of things like that, signified that that actor is channeling exactly who that man was. And at that point, I knew that we were on the right path.
Peter, I'll direct a question to you. You have several explosive scenes in the film, particularly one early on in Miami at a cantina, I guess. Can you tell me about preparing for that role, and just tell us a little bit about the character? Is he based on a real-life person, or is he a combination of several people?
He's based off of a real-life person who's obviously no longer living.
That's a spoiler alert, by the way.
No, I just did a lot of cocaine and swung real hard. What's to say? I guess in that scene, I don't think of that scene as explosive. In that scene, I thought that, like, me and Johnny had some secret language that we were speaking. And it didn't matter what was actually being said, that he and I were on the same wavelength. You know, you invent little games for yourself as an actor. It's hard to go back and describe them after you do them. Right. And they change from take to take. You play with different ideas. It all has to do with this fantastic cast that's been assembled. I mean, there are no bad actors in this movie. And so, you know, no matter where I was or what I was doing, it was always fascinating. And I obviously knew Scott because my wife did Crazy Heart with him long ago, not that long ago, I guess. And I just wanted to be a part of the party, you know. That's how I got involved.
We have time for one last question, and it's right here. Thank you.
For Johnny. Hi. Jimmy teaches quite outrageous lesson to his son. So, like, it's okay to hit other kid as long as nobody's watching. So, as an adult and dad, how did you feel saying that to that cute young child actor? And assuming that's what the lesson that you teach to your kids.
You're assuming that wouldn't be the advice I'd give my kids?
Yeah.
Wrong. No, well, I mean, myself, I didn't find it at all strange, that advice.
Nobody sees it didn't happen.
And, it's kind of like that. No, it's like I remember when I was a kid, this probably says a lot about, says a lot about a lot. I remember when I was a kid, and, I was little, like maybe 6 years old or something like that, and there was some little, horror at the school who was, kind of needling me or whatever. And I think I told my mom or something, and my mom, I come from nothing but hillbillies, and my mom said to me, all right, here's the deal. The next time anybody puts their hands on you, pick up a brick and lay them out. And I've taken that advice ever since. So it worked for me. And if my kid, if somebody tried to bully my kid, if they didn't destroy the little booger, I would.
That's great.
Thank you very much. Thank you, everyone, and thank you. Black Mass plays tonight.